I remember when I first moved into this accursed house. I was 10 years old and loved all things a 10-year-old boy loves. You know, climbing trees, catching bugs, playing cowboys and Indians, those sort of things. We had moved from the hustle and bustle of the Big Smoke to the small Cheshire village of Helsby. Helsby, with its prominent red stone hill, sits nestled at the top of Mersey. The hill sports a thick covering of gnarled trees, misshapen by the strong onshore winds that rush from their home on the Irish Sea, funneled by estuary, come in to rest at the foot of the hill. The village is also surrounded by a vast expanse of marsh that holds a depressing, sullen atmosphere, even on a clear, sunny day. The various wetland birds add in a constant chorus of shrill cries. Our new country home was, and still is, an old Jacobean house, with a sprawling garden to the rear, scaling the looming red hill behind. A venerable playground for a 10-year-old. The first thing I noticed upon moving to Helsby was how quiet it was at night. You could hear a pin drop, and this dead silence was quite unsettling, having been used to the constant ebb and flow of noise emanating from Liverpool's streets. I would sit up in my bed for hours, listening for any sort of noise, hoping I could hear people talk or the pitter-patter of mice scurrying around in the dark. Sometimes, though, I thought I could hear other things more sinister, things I knew were just beyond my sight, hidden in the inky shadows. The first time I became aware of the low, barely audible whisper was maybe 3 or 4 weeks after we had moved. I was not frightened or worried by this, as I merely assumed it was my parents talking or exchanging some heated words as they so often did. There was a fractious relationship with my mother wanting more for herself, and indeed us and my poor father being unable to provide. The whisper started during a tempestuous storm that raged outside my window, the wind and rain battering the rust-colored front of our house. I had just finished reading and was just about dozing off when I thought I heard my name being called in a low, muffled tone. Tanya, Tanya. It repeated perhaps 4 or 5 times. I quickly flicked on my bedside light, but couldn't for the life of me figure out where my name was being called from. I sat there in the dark, the covers pulled up to my chin. I must have sat like that for an hour or more, straining to hear. In the end, I put it down to my imagination, and eventually dozed off into a sound, dreamless sleep. The next morning, downstairs over breakfast, I asked, "Mother, did you call me last night?" She said that she hadn't, and turning to my father asking the same. He had not either. He told me that old houses made strange noises, and with the sound of last night's vicious storm, that I shouldn't worry, that I would soon get used to them. He jokingly teased, saying that my overactive imagination was playing tricks on me. Oh, how I wish that were true. Murky grey clouds still hung to the hills, giving it the impression that it was much more intense than it was. Looking up into the tree line, I was amazed by the volume of old trees that had fallen in the night, lying motionless on the hillside like fallen soldiers. Many of these trees appeared to have rotted from the inside out, probably due to some insidious fungus slowly draining the old tree's life. That evening, after dinner, I sat at a desk in the front room, doodling in a great scrapbook, quietly nestled in a mouldy, cobweb-filled alcove, when again I heard that menacing whispering of my name. Daniel. Daniel. I turned around and looked about the room, but there was nothing there. It couldn't be the storm now, as there wasn't one. So, as my father said, I put it down to my overactive imagination and continued to doodle, when again I heard Daniel. This time followed by a quick succession of pattering feet. Up, knocking my chair back, slowly approached the old mahogany sideboard where I had last heard the pattering of the small unseen feet come to a stop, only to find nothing there. Confused and frightened by this, I crouched down and looked under the sideboard, finding only dust-filled cobwebs. However, as I stood up, my fingers moved over a series of small scratches at the shin height of the sideboard leg, as if some miniature human-like figure had been hiding, watching me with tiny clawed hands gripped around the leg of the sideboard. This growing feeling of being watched grew over the following weeks, as the frequency of whispering, along with an accumulation of other bizarre sounds, came to a climax late one evening as I was playing close to the great oak just beyond our garden. The sun had almost set, and long twisted shadows were being cast across the lawn, although I was far too absorbed in collecting the abundant acorns scattered around the ancient tree to notice such things. That's when I spotted a pair of bright green eyes staring at me with malicious intent from beyond the clearing in the bushes. In fright, I dropped my collections of acorns and shuffled back in the dirt, trying to put some distance between myself and this unknown creature. Perhaps 10 or 12 seconds had passed, but in my mind it seemed like eternity, as the creature held its ground and stared dead into my eyes. Then, with the flash of a wide, toothy grin, it darted off into the bushes, leaving me trembling all over. I knew then that this was my unseen stalker. Not much happened after the incident in the garden that day, and the winter passed relatively uneventful. The leaves shifted through the spectrum of colors. Christmas came and went, and as the first signs of life had appeared once again on the looming heights of Helsby Hill, I grew confident that the evil little creature, with all that harm and hate in its eyes, had gone for good. We were in the midst of an unseasonably warm spring, and much of my free time was spent exploring the highs and lows of the hill at the back of our house. I had become an avid adventurer, being that little bit older, which gave me the confidence to wander further and further than previously allowed. This, in hindsight, was my undoing for one sunny weekend afternoon. I was hurriedly making my way up to the rat track I had worn into the garden lawn, bursting through the flimsy fence head first into the bushes and trees. I was scrambling and climbing steadily to the first vantage point on the hill when I felt a sharp, painful scratch on the back of my leg, followed by what sounded like laughter. When I had reached the huge rotted log which marked the vantage point, I stopped to examine the source of my pain, and to my horror found 5 tiny, evenly spaced tears in my trousers, which had also cut my skin and drawn blood. I sat there in shock for what seemed like an age, panic-stricken and paralyzed with fear, as the realization that whatever had been stalking me in my house was now actively following me, and what was worse, causing me harm. When I finally zoned back in, I felt a massive rush of adrenaline, and I hurriedly made my way home, only stopping to quickly listen to see if I was being followed. When I arrived home, I was shaken, and seeing my nervous state and my tatty condition of my trousers, my mother asked what had happened. I dismissed her by telling her the neighbor's dog had chased me, and in my effort to flee, had torn my trousers on a bramble, for I did not dare tell her the truth. Besides, would my parents have even believed me? That evening, as I prepared for bed, I was on edge, fearing whatever had attacked me that afternoon would make its way into the house, into my room, and this time cause me considerably more harm. I spent over an hour checking all the usual places a child checks, under the bed, in the wardrobe, and other numerous shadow-filled spaces around my room. Only when I had deemed my room creature-free did I venture to sleep. The night passed without incident, or so I thought. Upon waking, I found the bedsheets around me littered with criss-crossing of tiny clawed feet and handprints, some of which had only been centimeters from me, from my sleeping head. I let out a scream and ran from my room. Shrieking, I dragged my mother and father to my room to show them what had happened in the depths of night. Surely they had to believe me now. Entering the room and seeing them for themselves, the state of the bedsheet, they surmised that a wild animal had perhaps gotten in during the night. A wild animal here in Cheshire countryside? The closest thing to a wild animal was Mrs. Anderson's Shih Tzu, further along down the street. However, upon inspecting the footprints and the claw marks, they became more confused than anxious, and laughed it off as a clever prank I had played on them, telling me that I should apply those brains to my schoolwork. I went to school that day terrified out of my mind, knowing that something was living in the woods behind my house that was worse. I went to school that day terrified out of my mind, knowing that something was living in the woods behind my house, and that worse, it could enter my house unseen and climb onto my bed and do God knows what while I slept. The school day passed painfully slow, but it did allow me to think how I would deal with whatever was going on. Finally, school had finished, and I arrived home with my mind made up to take on whatever had come uninvited into my room that previous night. I sat that night well past my usual 8 p.m. bedtime. My mother and father had gone to bed, and as far as I could tell, were sound asleep. At around midnight, as I wholeheartedly fought to stay awake, I heard the pitter-patter of those horrible little clawed feet, followed by the low whispers of My heart started to race as I frantically scanned the room looking for the source of the whispered voice. Then suddenly my eyes fell upon it, standing there in the corner of my room. Heaven must have come through a small hatch I had never noticed in the bedroom floor, as it was covered by a small table. I guess it was used to access the piping underneath the house or something. It stood hunched, maybe 1.5 feet tall, with long, thin arms ending in short, stubby, claw-like fingers. It had huge, green, shining eyes that even in the low light of the room still shone unnaturally bright. It had huge, green, shining eyes that even in the low light of the room still shone unnaturally bright. Its torso was quite stumpy for the length of its arms and legs, as its legs were also long, ending in short, stubby feet with hideous clawed toes. Its skin, from what I could tell in the dim light of the room, was a mottled green-grey color, stretched over a bony, misshapen skeleton. It had shot across the room. There it was there on my bed, crawling towards me, its hideous clawing hands making tiny tears in the bedsheet, as its feet and legs left dirty smudges on my white linen, all the while whispering that horrible, guttural tone. Tanya, Tanya. I shut my eyes and hoped it would all go away. I opened my eyes, and the creature was gone. Bright spring sunshine threading its luminous tendrils through my bedroom curtain. Was it all a dream? I asked myself, assuming I must have fallen asleep and dreamt the entire thing. I jumped out of bed and hurried downstairs in search of breakfast. When I arrived in the kitchen, I could see my mother standing by the sink, with her face in her hands, heavy sobs lurching from her body. My father was standing there, with a hand on her back, making small, affectionate circles as if to comfort her. This shocked me. I approached, unsure of what had happened. Then my mother spoke in a faint, whispering cry. How could this have happened? How could this have happened? What has happened to our boy? I was confused. What boy? Did they mean me? I asked, Father, what is wrong? What has happened? He turned to look at me, saying nothing, his hazy eyes filled with tears. He gave my mother a short hug and walked towards me, all the while tears streaming down his face. I was growing more and more alarmed. I asked again, Father! Mother! What's happened? What's going on? Still, nothing. He reached the door and walked past me up the stairs. I followed him, unsure of what I would find as he headed towards my bedroom door. Turning the handle, he entered, the door giving its usual squeak, and there, through the opening, I could see a form on the bed, covered in my duvet. I screamed and rushed into the room. What was this? Who was this? I turned to my father standing there in the doorway. He seemed unsure whether to enter. He ignored me still. I stood motionless as he approached the bed and pulled back the covers. And there, in the bed, lay me. I know now that whatever lives in the wooded expanse of that redstone hill ruthlessly murdered me that night. That it still sits there in the undergrowth, waiting for another boy or girl to come live in my house. But I suppose it won't be all that bad. for at least I'll have someone to play with.